Hello, I'm Diana Thomas.
And I'm Tom Harper.
Welcome to That Wilbur Smith Show,
a podcast about the historical, geographical, natural, and human background to the world of Wilbur Smith.
The Zambezi comes to the sea through a delta of vast swampland and 100 confused, shallow channels spread out for 30 miles down the low, featureless coastline. Floating islands of papyrus grass break free from the main pastures which blanket the waters of the delta and are carried out to sea on the dirty brown water. Some of these islands are many acres in extent, and the roots of the plants are so entangled that they can support the weight of a heavy animal. On occasions, small herds of buffalo are trapped and carried 20 miles out to sea before the action of the waves smashes up the islands and plunges the great bovine animals into the water, prey for the big sharks which cruise the tainted estuary waters for just such a prize. The muddy smell of the swamps carries far from the land when the wind is right, and the same wind carries strange insects with it. There is a tiny spider, no bigger than the head of a wax vesta match, which lives in the papyrus banks of the delta. It spins a gossamer web on which it launches itself into the breeze in such numbers that the gossamer fills the sky in clouds, like smoke from a raging bushfire, rising many hundreds of feet and eddying and swirling in misty columns that are touched by the sunset into shades of pink and lovely pale mauve. The river pours a muddy brown effluent into the sea, silt enriched with the bodies of drowned animals and birds, and the huge Zambezi crocodile join the shark packs at the feast.
That evocative description was, of course, Wilbur Smith describing the estuary of the Zambezi in his novel Falcon Flies. And to discuss the Zambezi today, we are joined by the man who quite literally wrote the book on it, Professor Malyn Newitt, who has been writing about the area for over 50 years. He taught at the University of Rhodesia back in the day, and later at the University of Exeter, where he became Deputy Vice-Chancellor before becoming the Charles Boxer Professor of History at King's College London. He's written numerous books on Portuguese colonial history, the history of Mozambique, and the history of Portugal. His most recent book, which is why he's here today, is just called The Zambezi, A History. So, Malyn, thank you so much for joining us.
A pleasure.
And I suppose the first question I wanted to ask you is, clearly this has been an interest of yours pretty much for your whole career. Your first book, I think, was Portuguese Settlement on the Zambezi, and you've come in the 70s, and you've come right back to that subject. So, is there something about the river that draws you to it?
Well, it started really with an interest in Mozambique as a whole. But while I was teaching at the University of what was then Southern Rhodesia, I made a number of visits to the Zambezi, to sites along its bank. I crossed it in a canoe. Later, I crossed it on behind a steam train, which I hired for the purpose. And I've been particularly interested in the society that emerged and grew up along the banks from the 16th century onwards. I think it's a unique story. It's one of incredible interest for people who want to know about the long history of Africa. And the Zambezi is the spine of this story.
It covers an extraordinary kind of swathe, doesn't it? Like a kind of upside down scythe, kind of all the way up from the borders practically of the Congo in Zambia, and then sort of in a great swathe through Zambia, almost into Angola, then down along sort of the Zimbabwe border into Mozambique. So I mean, it's passing through in both historical and geographical terms. I mean, not just an enormous geographical swathe, but I mean, in humankind terms, the history of all those peoples must be extraordinary that have lived along its banks.
Yes, it's 1,600 miles in extent. And as you say, it curves its way from Zambia, where it rises, and comes down through the Barotse floodplain, and then through all the gorges down to the lower Zambezi. And to understand this river, as I point out in the book, it's usually convenient to break the river into three sections because their histories are very distinct. And these sections of the river are or were historically marked by virtually impassable cataracts and gorges, so that the river is in three sections rather than a continuous whole that flows down to the sea.
So if we start at the north, the top, the origins of the river, where does it rise, and what kind of country is it that it's rising in and flowing through to begin with, the sort of upper part of it?
Conventionally, it's thought of as rising in Kalini Hill on the northwest of Zambia, and effectively it's rising at the peak of the watershed between the Zaire river system and the Zambezi's own river system. And it's a very small stream when it first rises. And the point is that it then picks up the waters of numerous rivers that enter it on both banks. And it's very much subject to the seasonal rains of Central Africa that turn it, or used to turn it, into a huge flood in the months from January through to May. And then in the dry season, from sort of April onwards, the river can shrink, or certainly in its lower reaches, can shrink into really a very modest stream. So it's not so much a river as a whole drainage system that brings the waters of Central Africa down into the valley, and is very much subject to the flooding that occurs when the rains come.
Did people take advantage in Egypt? Of course, you had an entire society. We've talked a lot about ancient Egypt because Wilbur Smith wrote a lot about it. And the entire history of Egypt and the entire society of Egypt is founded on the fact that the Nile floods. And therefore you have this fertile strip running for, again, about 1,500 miles. It's north-south through Egypt. And the entire culture grew up on that strip. Did the people of the Zambezi, or the people who live around the Zambezi, was the flooding of the river and then the receding of the river as much a part of their lives too?
Yes, it was. And it was interesting to hear that reading of Wilbur Smith's description of the Delta, because the major changes are now taking place as a result of the building of dams. The all sections of the river were subject to seasonal flooding. At the height of the floods, the river could be 20 feet above its dry season level. And the valleys on each side of the river were flooded and, as in Egypt, left behind rich alluvial soil on which people could grow crops. The point to make, however, is the width of this valley varies greatly. In the upper reaches, the river can spread out over 50 or so miles of river valley. This is the so-called Barotse floodplain, and it produces an enormously rich grassland on which herds of cattle can be fed. As you come down, the river valley narrows, and below the Victoria Falls, it can be really quite narrow. Nevertheless, there is still a small floodplain, and it was a very fertile land in which the Tonga people, could live and grow their crops. And then when you go further down the river into what's often referred to as the lower Zambezi, again, you have a much wider river valley, again, which floods the river will flood up to 2 miles wide in its lower reaches before reaching the delta. And the delta also flooded at the peak of the wet season. And the whole character of the delta, which was described in Wilbur Smith's account, was determined by the annual floods that came down. And one of the points of the book is to draw attention to how important this was for the people who lived in the valley, but how this whole ecosystem, social and ecosystem, has been changed by the building of the dams.
Yeah. And I was struck by how, I mean, a number of things that I thought I knew about rivers were sort of upended reading your book, because first of all, we think of rivers as starting small and getting bigger. But actually, in the dry season, the lower reaches of the Zambezi can actually be petering out. And there's, I think you describe how some of it's got 5 or more sort of recognized mouths of the river. And some of them dry up and become completely sandy and actually cut off the ports that have been built at the mouth. They're like Kilimani. So as you say, the character can change very much. And the other thing that struck me was that it's very hard to build river ports, and particularly for steamships in the sort of Victorian era, if the river changes its dimensions so much from wet season to dry season.
Yes, the lower Zambezi used to have a particular character. Because of the floods in the wet season, huge quantities of silt and sand were brought down and deposited along not just in the delta, but along the lower reaches of the river, forming islands. And the point is that these islands and the streams between them changed every year. Sometimes they would flow close to the southern bank. Sometimes the river would be diverted hundreds of yards, miles even, away from the banks of the river. And this made the growth of ports, as we would normally understand them, extremely difficult. When eventually a river port was built at Chindi in the early 20th or late 19th century, everybody thought the problem had been solved. The river had now got a stable channel into the sea, and dry docks and quays and so on were built at Chindi and on a concession made to the British. And then the river started to change again, as it had done historically for hundreds, thousands of years. And the whole river bank of Chindi began to collapse. They had to move the port installations back, only to find that they were undermined and collapsed again after floods the next year. So the nature of the lower Zambezi is really very problematic for shipping. And the Portuguese, in the long history of the region, never tried to use the delta entrances, or only very seldom. Instead, they used the river, which was known as the Kwakwa River, that entered from the sea and on which the Portuguese built the town of Quelimane. But the Kwakwa River only has water in the peak of the wet season. So it's only connected to the Zambezi at the peak of the wet season. And in the dry season, the connection between the port at Quelimane and the Zambezi had to be by porters carrying goods overland to relaunch on the river. So it's hugely problematic. And at the height of the dry season, the Zambezi can, on its lower reaches, can dwindle to only 100 yards wide and can be so shallow that people could walk across it. And then, of course, in the height of the wet season, it can extend up to 2 miles wide.
Obviously that changes the kind of history of the river. Again, comparing it to the Nile, the fact that the Nile was navigable for a huge distance, and even you could get around the cataracts, meant that you could trade up and down it, you can move armies up and down it, you can do almost anything up and down the river. Whereas Zambezi, not being navigable, kind of prevents sort of the human flow of societies and peoples. Tell me about the original indigenous people who would have been living on its banks, kind of in pre-colonial times. I mean, from obviously, I imagine very different from one end of the river to the other.
Yes, the as far as we know, so to speak, the people who lived along the valley were the people who are generically known as Tonga. But this word Tonga actually covers people of with different dialects and different ethnicities. But they do all have a similar social structure, which is based upon small villages, which are lineage based. They are inhabited by all the members of a single lineage. And they don't have central political institutions. There are various reasons for this, but probably the most interesting reason is the predominance of the spirit mediums. The religious systems along the valley were focused very much on mediums who spoke with the voices of dead ancestors and assumed the role of leaders in the communities, so that, if you like, secular chiefs and secular rulers always had a lesser importance than these very powerful, very influential spiritual mediums. And this, again, is a characteristic of the people of the Zambezi Valley. When you get above the Victoria Falls, you're into a different world where the populations are more related to those of the Zaire, Angola region. But they again were of very mixed ethnicities. They tended to be in small groups. And one consequence of the lack of centralized, if you like, powerful political units was that the peoples of the valley were very subject to being dominated, raided, or dominated by the more powerful, more centralized states of the plateau region. So, one theme of the book all the way through is the way in which the peoples of the valley, although they had a great continuity in their social and religious existence, were nevertheless endlessly raided, endlessly dominated by successions of powerful warlike groups who come from the plateau regions.
In fact, one of the things in the book that comes through is that actually most of these empires aren't really interested in the valley much. They'll go down, they'll raid, they'll take some tribute or some slaves, or whatever it is they want, and then they'll go back because they're all based in the highlands, which are far more salubrious, and you don't have the malaria, you don't have the diseases that make livestock so impossible to raise in the valley, and so there's a sense that it's kind of a no man's land from the big sort of empire point of view. And then into this rather inhospitable place that the larger empires of Africa have mostly treated as a sort of buffer zone, the Portuguese stumble.
Yes, I think that's a very good description. It is a kind of no man's land, and the river forms quite a barrier to stop would-be conquerors crossing and establishing themselves on the other banks. One reason for this is that it's not only the character of the river which is a barrier, it's the escarpment on each side. The Zambezi Valley is lined, if you like, certainly in its middle section, by a dense and very difficult of access mountains known as the escarpment. They can be 30 miles or more wide before you reach the high plateau lands. And these escarpments were very difficult to cross and to reach the valley. And they tend to be very dry, and it was quite difficult for permanent settlements to be based within the escarpment. So you had the plateau, which, as you said, it's salubrious, where you can breed cattle. And then you get this escarpment, which is very inhospitable, very dry, very difficult of access. And then you have the river valley, where people can live on the floodplain. So this made it very difficult for the states of the which were formed on the high plateau to establish themselves on the valley floor.
I mean, we were talking last week actually to another professor called Joost Fontaine from Johannesburg University about Great Zimbabwe and the very strong links that the people of Great Zimbabwe in European terms in medieval times had with the coast, and from that trade routes out into Arabia, India, China. Was the Zambezi, were the peoples of the Zambezi and the culture of the Zambezi and even the river itself, for the reasons you've just described, kind of cut off in a way that other parts of Africa were not? I mean, and what finally drew Westerners into that part of the world? I mean, the book I was reading from, it's set in, Tom, remind me, 1850s?
1860.
1860s. So 1860s, and white British people are only beginning to start setting foot in the interior as we're up the Zambezi. So what did finally draw people there? And was it in fact quite late in having that either voluntary or involuntary encounter with the West?
Well, as far as we know, Great Zimbabwe and the cultures that grew up there, growing rich in gold mining in particular, tended to trade with the coast either via the Sabi River further south than the Zambezi, or through the Manica highlands down to a port at Sofala, which is very near the modern city of Beira. The Zambezi only really started to play a role in this gold trade of the Zimbabwe Plateau region towards the end of the 15th century. Now, this coincides with the decline of Great Zimbabwe, the reasons for which are not really understood, but it coincides with the movement northwards of Karanga, or Shona, if you like, chiefs who established themselves at the end of the 15th century in the northern part of the Zimbabwe Plateau. And from there, it was easier for them to trade with the Indian Ocean peoples using the Zambezi as a river of access. And we know now that at the end of the 15th century and beginning of the 16th century, a number of new Islamic trading settlements were built north of the Zambezi, particularly at a place called Angosh, and on the Zambezi itself, which began to be used about that time for access to the interior. The Portuguese began to find out about the nature of this gold trade in the early 16th century when they settled themselves permanently in Sofala and Mozambique Island. But it took them some time, in fact, not until the mid-16th century, before they themselves were able to penetrate the Zambezi and start participating directly in the gold trade. And one reason why it took them so long is, as we've already discussed, the nature of the delta and the nature of the rivers of access to the Zambezi. It was very complicated to find a route through the delta, through the lowlands, to the mainstream of the Zambezi. So the Portuguese were not able to establish themselves there till the mid-16th century. Now, the interesting thing is that although the Dutch make inroads into Portugal's maritime empire in the early 17th century, they never succeeded in capturing Mozambique Island, and they soon gave up their attempt to trade on the coast of East Africa. And in fact, until the Dutch settlement of the Cape in 1652, there was no kind of Dutch presence in that particular region at all. And the Portuguese had the gold trade of East Africa more or less to themselves until the mid-17th century. The English don't come into the scene at all until, well, the 19th century.
Yeah, so the Portuguese have I guess, 300 or 400 years of fairly uninterrupted occupation. But what I was really struck from your book was that this isn't colonialism as we think of it. It's not a top-down, decisions made in Lisbon being effected on the ground by armies and administrators from Portugal in the Zambezi River. It's very much its own society that's quite unique in some ways in sort of patterns of African colonization.
Yes, that is correct. It's not that the Portuguese didn't try to establish a kind of, as you just describe it, a top-down empire. It's in 1569 they did send a large army. I say large; it was some hundreds of professional soldiers, because they hoped they would be able to conquer what they understood to be a wealthy African empire, similar to the South American empires that had been conquered by the Spanish. But this particular army was completely destroyed by disease. All the soldiers died, or virtually all of them died. Some of them were killed fighting the local Africans. And the Portuguese realized that you simply couldn't send a large army into Africa. It was an impossible enterprise, particularly because of the disease environment in the Zambezi Valley. And so from then onwards, the Portuguese presence is very much that of individual entrepreneurs, if you like, individual traders who penetrate the interior, who establish links with African rulers, who trade at the gold fairs on the edge of the plateau. And if you want a comparison with this, it's not with Spanish America at all, or the British colonies in the Caribbean or anything like this. It's much more with the sort of West Africa, the Guinea region, where you get exactly similar enterprise by individual Portuguese who infiltrate, if you like, African society, adopt local African customs and ways of operating, and live as traders, creating in the process what I describe as a Creole, and is now this term is now widely used, a Creole society, a mixture of European and African characteristics. So there is, although the Portuguese occasionally dream of establishing a formal empire, a new Brazil, if you like, in East Africa, they never get anywhere near achieving that. And their presence in East Africa remains that of a sort of Creole, if you like, mixed race elite who are living very much an African lifestyle and trading in gold and ivory, and with a considerable amount of success.
I mean, as the British influence presumably comes up from much later from the south. I mean, it's the movement up from South Africa into Rhodesia. I mean, Cecil Rhodes coming upwards rather than, as it were, in from the coast. Is that right?
Well, yes, but Cecil Rhodes is fairly later.
I mean, we're moving into that's the place, sort of 19th century.
Initially, it's elephant hunters and missionaries, if you like, who make a road north through what is now Botswana and reach the Zambezi at the confluence of the Zambezi and Chobe rivers. And Livingstone is very well known as one of the earliest of these, but he's not the earliest. There are elephant hunters who have preceded him up from the south, and Livingstone, if you like, piggybacks on their expertise when he makes his first journey up there in 1851. But at the same time, don't forget the traders who are coming from Angola. Livingstone liked to forget them as far as possible because he wanted to be the first European to break into this upper Zambezi world. But it was already been broken into, if you like, by traders from Angola. Way back into the 1830s, possibly earlier, traders from Angola were reaching the upper reaches of the Zambezi and already building trading settlements there, which Livingstone refused to recognize as being in any way linked to Europeans.
And these were white traders, African traders, and what were they trading?
Well, again, they were called Mambari, but they were Creole. Again, they were people of mixed cultural background. One of them, the best known, was a man called Silva Porto. He was actually a white European, but most of the Mambari were people of mixed descent who were coming from the Portuguese settlements in Angola. So the British connection is from South Africa. It's hunters, missionaries, but at the same time, the Portuguese are coming from the Angolan, from the West African coast, and they are much more interested in slaves than ivory. People, the British people who are coming up from the south, they want ivory and Christians, if you like.
Well, indeed, that's one of both the Christianity and the ivory are two of the driving forces behind the plot of A Falcon Flies, with which our reading began. Indeed, many other Wilbur books,
and indeed the slaves as well. There's a few things in the Portuguese Creole society that I just wanted to dig into because I found them so fascinating. So one is, you mentioned they think they're going to found another sort of Spanish South American empire, and it doesn't really work out. To the point that when the Spanish discover loads of silver in their South American possessions, the Portuguese are absolutely convinced that there's silver in the Zambezi region, and there's reports go back for decades, I think, saying, "Oh yes, we're on the track of the silver mines. We're about to find the silver mines. We found traces of silver. We're nearly going to find the silver mines," and in fact, there is no silver anywhere in that region. So these delusions sort of persist and take on a life of their own.
This is a quite extraordinary story, and it goes back to the 16th century when the Spanish did discover these fabulous silver mines in Bolivia and Mexico. And the Portuguese are convinced that there must be silver in Africa as well. And it's not only in East Africa, they also think that there's a mountain of silver in Angola called Cambambe. And they send military expeditions to try and locate this mountain of silver. But there is no silver ore in Africa as there is in South America, nowhere. And this belief that there are these great silver mines persists throughout the 17th century. And even into the 18th century, the Portuguese are still believing that there are these silver mines, which they only have to use a bit more cunning, a bit more effort, and they will locate them. And it's quite an extraordinary story of self-delusion. But I try to explain in the book what is really going on. First of all, you have to remember that Cortes and Pizarro in Mexico, as a result of their conquests and discoveries of gold and silver and so on, were turned into noblemen. They were made marquis, and huge social rise in the social scale back in Spain. And the Portuguese believed that they could achieve the same kind of social climbing. The Africans also, who had told them about the silver, also believed that there was a lot in that for them. They would receive rewards, they would receive gifts from the Portuguese, they would receive sort of social enhancement in their own terms of their own society. So lots of people had a vested interest in keeping this story going. And it was kept going right into the 18th century, when eventually the Portuguese have to realize that there is no silver at all and concentrate on what there is, which is gold, the trade in gold, and of course in ivory as well. And if you look at the documents of the 17th century, you begin to find out there are clues as to what's going on, how the Portuguese were using silver Spanish coins, melting them down, and then pretending that this was silver obtained from the mines. And in one really funny case, it turns out that they melted down a silver fork, which one of the Portuguese owned. And then, having melted down this silver fork, said, "Look, here is some silver which we've obtained from very rich silver ore." And this is in order to keep this story alive.
It's such an irony that Angola, where they didn't find any silver, would later have so much oil that by, I think, 2012, the Prime Minister of Portugal was going to Angola, cap in hand, asking them for a loan because Portugal had run out of money, but Angola was now so rich with oil that it could afford to sponsor them. Just to go to the sort of the geography and the appearance of the river. I mean, I guess the single feature on the Zambezi, which for non-African listeners and people, just general British and American, European, I mean, the Victoria Falls of just the epic. I mean, presumably you've been there many times. I'm just curious what your personal sense is of seeing the falls.
Well, I've been twice, in fact, to Victoria Falls, seen them. And I don't think there's anything quite in the world like it. I mean, there are other majestic waterfalls, but the sheer scale of the Zambezi falling over into the gorge, I don't think is matched anywhere in the world. For instance, the lip of the falls is over a mile long, and at the height of the floods, water is pouring over this mile-long face of the waterfall down into a chasm where you can hardly see the bottom. It's as though it's falling into the center of the earth. And it produces, of course, this spray which rises into the sky with a continuous rainbow and creating a tropical rainforest along the banks of the river and round the gorge, which again is an extraordinary feature because the land otherwise in that part of Africa is dry savanna bush. And then suddenly there is this tropical rainforest on the lip of the falls. It's a breathtaking sight. I don't think anyone who has seen the Victoria Falls would ever forget it and would ever see anything like it in the world. And notably, it's not just the falls themselves, but this extraordinary gorge that winds deep in the earth for miles downriver, winding in a series of hairpin bends along a geological fault, which the river has sort of cut back to the edge of the falls as they are today. It's a quite extraordinary sight. And although I haven't been there recently, on the whole, the Victoria Falls was saved from too much exploitation by tourist development and so on taking place some distance away from the falls. So you can still see them as Livingstone saw them in the 1850s. But I haven't been there recently. That may all have changed.
But the geography of the river, of course, has also been changed by dams. And you mentioned earlier about the environmental changes. Am I right in thinking that there has been a drastic loss of rainfall in the lack of rainfall in the past few years, and as well the lakes of the dams are beginning to dry up, and presumably therefore that affects the flow downstream of the dams as well?
Yes, absolutely. The first dam was the Kariba Dam, which was built in the 1950s. Then there was the Cabora Bassa Dam, which was completed in 1974. And these dams, between them, created huge lakes, 200 miles in length, and turned the central areas of the Zambezi, in effect, into two huge lakes, no longer a flowing river, but two huge lakes. Now, these dams were built to generate electricity, almost entirely or largely for South Africa, although the Kariba Dam was also supplying the two Rhodesias. But once in the 2010s, climate change did begin to affect the rainfall in the area. Now, nobody knows if this is a unique event or if it's a recurring feature, because there's quite a lot in my book and also in the research about the periodic droughts that affected this part of Africa. And I particularly describe the great drought of the 1820s, when all the sort of streams dried up and the river fell and so on. But at the height of the drought in the 2010s, the Zambezi ceased to flow over the Victoria Falls. And if you go onto the internet and look for the Victoria Falls the year 2019, you'll see that there was no water at all going over the falls. It's a terrifying picture. And although the rains have recovered somewhat, there is plenty of evidence that this whole area is entering into a dry phase. Now, as a result of this, the levels of the lakes have fallen. The ability of the dams to generate electricity has been severely cut. And everything now depends upon, I suppose, whether the rainfalls restore themselves. But this has not stopped people planning more dams. And there's, I think, approval has now been given for going ahead of another dam below Kawarabassa, the Mfanda Nkua Dam, and there are plans for two more dams, one in the Mpata Gorge and one which will actually flood the Batoka Gorge up to within half a mile of the Victoria Falls themselves.
Agree.
So this would in fact turn the Zambezi into just a succession of lakes right down until to the very lowest levels of the river. And this decline in the rainfall, coupled with the retention of water in the lakes, has affected the lower river. The delta no longer floods.
Gosh.
Wilbur Smith would no longer be able to describe the delta in the way that he did in your reading. The sea has invaded the delta because not enough water is coming down to keep the salt water at bay. And the whole ecology of the lower river has totally changed. So the nature of the Zambezi today, except in its very highest reaches, has totally changed. And I've just been on a trip up the Douro River in Portugal, and that's much smaller than the Zambezi, but it's very interesting because that was a stormy torrent that used to pour down from the plateaulands of Spain and along gorges and rapids. And then in the 1960s and 70s, 6 dams were built on the Douro River. And they have turned that river now into a series of placid lakes. And if you go up in a boat, you go through locks from one placid lake to another. It's a total transformation of a whole river system. And that's what is happening to the Zambezi.
You mentioned the drought of 1820, which in your book is one of 3 changes that sort of hits the region in the 1820s. And one of the things I was struck by was that recorded history, I guess, starts in the 16th century when the Portuguese arrive. And since then, it seems to have been fairly stable. And the Portuguese, this Creole society, in a sense, is from the point of view of the Tonga people, is just another external power, like the powers they're used to coming down from the highlands, that comes in, it sets itself up, takes some tribute, seizes power, but life sort of continues. And then the 1820s, there are these 3 factors you describe, which actually, as I read your book, I realized that this is setting up the conditions that falcon flies will take place in. So there's a drought, there's also a Nguni invasion, and then there is an increased demand for slaves, both of which will play their role in the novel. So what are the impact of those 3 factors starting in the 1820s?
I think it's important not to romanticize the past, but there is plenty of evidence that the early 19th century in southern and central Africa was a very destabilizing period when settled African societies, again, one shouldn't romanticize this and too much, but when settled African societies were brutally disrupted by a series of related events. And this affected South Africa as well as the Central Africa Zambezi region. There was a long dry period. It looks as though it was a period of about 20 years, but reaching a peak in the mid-1820s when the rains were very irregular and in fact almost ceased. And this coincided with disruptive warfare in the Natal region of South Africa, which is associated with the Zulu kingdom. And in my opinion, the Zulu kingdom was disrupted in this way because of the drought conditions, because it was a cattle owning society and the drought conditions were putting huge pressures on people. As a result of which, various what one can describe as Zulu Nguni warlords led their followers northwards to try and find areas to settle which weren't so affected by the drought and the ecological conditions. And but there they found in the Zambezi region was also affected in this way. And interestingly, although they settled there for maybe up to sort of 10 years, a number of these Nguni Zulu warrior groups crossed the Zambezi and headed north, going as far north as Tanzania and modern Malawi and so on. These proved extremely disruptive, and by one of the coincidences of history, this coincided with the campaign in the Atlantic against the slave trade, which was headed by the British. And as the British succeeded in closing down the supply of slaves from West Africa, so the slave traders moved to East Africa. And by the slave traders, I mean people from Cuba, from Brazil, from the southern states of the US. And this coincided with this very disruptive period caused by the drought and the Zulu invasions, with the result that a large slave trade grew up in Eastern Africa, which began to transform the nature of society, the nature of political units, and so on in that region, with the result that the early 19th century proved to be a transforming period for the peoples of Central Africa and created the conditions which, of course, were later exploited by European colonialists.
Of course, in A Falcon Flies, we have Mungo St. John, the great villain of the piece, who is an American slave trader who has come precisely for the reasons you're describing to get slaves from East Africa because the West Africa trade has been shut down. The other thing in relation to the book that I was struck by is in this period, I think I'm right in saying, the Portuguese Creole society seems to have broken down a bit, and it's a period of warlords. Is that right?
Yes, the nature of the Creole society changed quite a lot because of the drought and the collapse of the local economy. As a result, quite a lot of the Creole community left East Africa and went to, as far as we know, to Portuguese India, to Goa and so on. And the economy, which had been based on gold mining, on agriculture, on the sort of feudal estates of the Creole community, this economy collapsed and opened the way for a different pattern of Creole existence. You get the warlords who recruit soldiers from, they're basically slave soldiers, and then embark upon the slave trade themselves, because this is now far more lucrative than ivory or gold. Gold has ceased to be mined effectively as a result of the drought. So you now get a series of these military warlords who are living by slavery and slaving, which is a quite different setup from what had existed in the 17th and 18th century, when the slave trade had not been important. In fact, it had hardly existed at all. And these new warlord slavers, if you like, create these large fortified towns or fortresses in the Zambezi Valley, which become a very distinctive feature and which are described by the Europeans who enter this region at the time, including Livingstone, who visits one of them and describes in detail what it was like. So yes, we now have a world dominated by warlords who embark on a slave trade in a big way. And this is very different from the earlier society, which had been focused on trade, and agriculture.
And I think we can infer that Wilbur's definitely been using those sources as research for his novel. I was really struck. One of the things that's always fascinated me about Wilbur's writing is the way he will take the name of a character who existed in history and apply them to an analogous but clearly different character in his story. And it happens again here because in A Falcon Flies, two of the most detestable villains are the Pereira brothers. I think there's Carnacho and I think Alphonse is the other one. And in fact, reading your book, there is in fact a warlord or a family of warlords, maybe called the Pereiras of Makonga, so who presumably are up to their necks in the slave trade and trying to sort of dominate the region.
Yes, very, very much. They're a family of Indian origin, usually referred to as the Caetano Pereiras, and they not only established themselves on the north bank of the river, upstream of Tet, but they actually conquer a considerable area of the country and establish themselves, if you like, as paramount chiefs or even kings, if you like, of a kingdom which is known as Makanga. They're an interesting family because some of them went on the first Portuguese exploring expeditions into Zambia, and they are a very good example of the way in which these Creole families lived in both worlds. They have African names, they have Portuguese names, they have their children baptized in a Portuguese church, but they themselves have spirit mediums whom they consult over difficult decisions. And the Pereiras of Makanga survived until 1902, when their the kingdom was eventually occupied, defeated, if you like, by the Portuguese. And that's very interesting that they've been picked up by Wilbur Smith and their story used in that way.
Another thing he was very interested in from quite early in his work, from the early 70s, was the increasing influence of China as it were as a new kind of quasi-imperial power, economic imperialism in Africa. And the Zambezi has been affected by that in terms of Chinese investment in the very dams you're talking about, which is kind of ironic given the ecological damage wreaked by various dams in the Yangtze and rivers in China. To what extent now is China in that region playing the role of a quasi-imperialist power in terms of the economic control and kind of almost turning nations into almost like indentured nations because they are indebted and can't get out of the debt that the Chinese have put them in?
Well, I think this is a story for other countries in Africa as well as Mozambique. But Mozambique is an example, and the Chinese investment in the dams can be paralleled with Chinese investment in infrastructure, railway infrastructure, building of roads and bridges, this kind of thing. And as you say, because China doesn't set the same kind of conditions on loans that are set by the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, African rulers are very tempted to take the money from China. And then they find that not only are they deeply indebted to China, but that China is what they're really interested in is the exploitation of African resources. In the case of Angola, it's obviously oil, but in Mozambique, there are important resources in terms of timber, coal, and natural gas. But I would make the point that China is not alone in this grab, if you like, for Africa's resources. And there's been extensive investment also from India and from Brazil in Mozambique, also, if you like, as unscrupulous in its way as that of the Chinese. But that's the story of much of Africa, I'm afraid.
And in fact, Diana and I were talking before the show, and Diana was saying that the Zambezi is almost sort of an index of colonial history from the African peoples who would sort of demand tribute in the sort of pre-colonial period through the Portuguese, then the British and the other European nations. And I was really struck in your book how late Europe comes to the Zambezi. It's not, obviously, excepting the Portuguese, but it's not really until the 1840s or 50s that they even start mapping it properly. And then by 1884, we're getting into the scramble for Africa, and suddenly everyone wants a piece of it. But in your book, you say they almost don't know why. So you end up with the Caprivi Strip, which is this extraordinary little appendage that's attached to Namibia that crosses between Botswana and Zambia. And I've actually stood on the edge of the Caprivi Strip and looked into it from Botswana. And I'd never appreciated that the reason it exists is purely so Namibia would have access to the Zambezi. This is sort of a line drawn on a map in colonial times. Even though they didn't really know why they needed access to the Zambezi, it just seemed like something they ought to have.
It was originally not Namibia, of course, it was the Germans.
Yeah.
German Southwest Africa. It was really the Germans who demanded access to the Zambezi. And nobody quite knows why they demanded this. The idea that the Germans didn't know about the Victoria Falls and thought that access to the Zambezi would give them access to a big navigable river, I think is completely discredited. Of course they knew about the nature of the river. And the only explanation for the Caprivi Strip is Germany's determination to be at the top table, so to speak, when any significant international negotiations were taking place. And this, of course, has been inherited by South Africa and now by Namibia, because they are now a riverain state, the Zambezi. They have a say in how the Zambezi's waters are going to be used. And the importance of this in international diplomacy, I suppose, makes it very important. But it is one of the most extraordinary anomalies of the scramble for Africa. And of course, in order for the Germans to have the Caprivi Strip, the British, who agreed to it in 1890, had to unilaterally dismember part of the Barotse Kingdom in order to give a slice of it to the Germans.
So a classic case of, as it were, you get all across the Middle East, Africa, of just the ways in which European powers just draw lines on maps without the slightest regard for the people who are living there or the cultural identities.
Yes, you only have to look at the map to see they got their ruler out and just drew lines and squares and so on where they liked. Of course, the rivers of Africa did impose themselves to some extent. The Zambezi, of course, becomes a frontier between Zimbabwe, Zambia. The Cunene River in Angola formed the frontier between Angola and German Southwest Africa. Otherwise, they just drew lines where they pleased. The only thing that was considered was the politics, international politics of the European powers at the time. But interestingly enough, there's been no significant move in Africa to redraw any of these maps. Although there have been, of course, independence movements within African countries, which for the most part haven't got anywhere, but independence movements by ethnic groups that feel they have been very badly treated by this carve-up.
Well, brutal wars in Congo, Nigeria, Eritrea. I mean, yeah, it's left scars. I was also struck looking at just do my own little quiet research, was that that going back to the dams, the treatment of the local people by the Portuguese who were still running Mozambique at that point in the Cabora Bassa region seems egregious, even by the standards of colonial powers. I mean, they just were completely indifferent to the disruption, suffering, removal from their land of the peoples who are having to make way for the dam. They were not exactly covering themselves in glory in Angola either. I mean, was there something as were different about the nature of rule if you go down the Zambezi River between, shall we say, Rhodesia, which goodness knows has its own history, and Mozambique, in the kind of nature and the character of what it was to be an African in those countries?
Well, I think you've answered your own question. But it's not just the Portuguese. The Kariba Dam, built by the Central African Federation, effectively by Britain, involved the forcible movement of 60,000 people from the area of the lake against their will, and relocation of them onto higher ground around the lake without any effective compensation. And there is still a movement today to try and get some compensation for the societies that were moved at that time. I think colonial countries saw African population that you can treat them how you like because they are going to benefit from civilization, which is represented by the dams. But in fact, they don't benefit. They usually move into areas which have not been occupied before, usually for very good reason, and there is no compensation provided. But I would add that the successor governments have not been any more kind towards their population. There have been in Mozambique, for instance, the development of the coal mining areas north of the Zambezi in Mozambique have led to widespread deportations of population, again, without adequate compensation, without consultation. And as the dams have been developed downstream, there have been massive relocations of population. One estimate is that 100,000 people have been relocated from the lower Zambezi Valley. Again, without so to speak, much consideration for their traditional way of life and so on. And I think it's worth adding that the Great Cabora Bassa Dam doesn't supply Mozambique with very much electricity. It's not as if the people of Mozambique have benefited by it. The electricity is all sold to South Africa. And the next dam to be built, the Mfanda Nkua Dam, it looks as though that also is going to be built with South African purchasers for its electricity. And there simply isn't an infrastructure in Mozambique to benefit from the electricity of these dams. So the successor regimes have not been really any more kind to the ordinary peasant population.
So yet again, you have external powers taking the resources.
I guess my only question to Malyn would be, my only question would be, looking forward, it seems to me that the future for the river that you're describing is basically a series of large ponds that may or may not be supplied by water if it rains again. Seems like a very sad one for a great river has been reduced to something far more banal. Does that seem reasonable? I mean, it seems like a sad end for a great river, is what I'm saying.
Well, that's the way I view it, because if these two more dams are built on the Zambezi, the whole lower river will become just a kind of trickle. The delta, who knows, it will probably be flooded by the sea. The whole ecosystem will have collapsed because these dams do release water downstream, but in a very irregular way, so that no pattern of flood and so on can be sustained. The upper river may still, that is above the Victoria Falls. There are no dams planned, I think, for that upper river. But the Zambezi River Authority has drawn up huge plans for extracting water from the upper river to send to Namibia in particular, but also to Zambia for irrigation purposes. If you add to that the drying of the climate generally, there simply won't be water to maintain even the lakes behind the dams. The future of the Zambezi is critical, in my opinion. I'm surprised that international bodies are still willing to finance dams on the river that are so problematic. It is a very sad story, but perhaps you can't be sentimental and sad about change.
It's interesting. I think one of the themes of your book has been that how poorly understood the river has been by outsiders for almost for as long as we've been recording its history, and the way that it was sort of explored quite late. It never captured the imagination in the way that the search for the headwaters of the Nile or the Niger did. And it sounds as though we're still, in a sense, getting it wrong, even after all these years. But hopefully, this podcast has shed a small amount of light on it for our listeners. Certainly, I've learned a huge amount about a river whose name I knew, but I knew the Victoria Falls, but couldn't have told you much else. So, Malyn, thank you so much for joining us today and talking about this river, which I guess has been a thread running through your career as well, from your days as a graduate student to your recent book.
Well, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to talk about my book and the very important topics that we've raised in this discussion.
So it's goodbye from me, Tom Harper.
And it's goodbye from me, Diana Thomas.
That Wilbur Smith Show is produced by Christopher Wynne. Music by Dewey DeLay. Executive producer Niso Smith.